Hello and welcome back to the TikATeeMethod for this milestone video as we are now in double digits for week 10's video. I'm so glad you're joining me. Please help me celebrate. When I count back from 3, I want you to smash that like button. Are you ready? In 3, 2, 1, bam! Thank you so much. Every single like really helps out the channel. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do so now and hit that notification bell so you get every video. I've got my Tik-A Tuesdays and my Sight Reading Sundays. Great supplemental videos to go along with my book, Rhythmic Sight Reading, the TikATeeMethod. My name is Ron Castingway, longtime educator, composer, author, conductor, clinician, and performer. In week 10, we are going to be exploring a brand new 2-beat musical sight word. It's got some cool 8th note syncopation, so we're not going to waste any time. We're going to get right into the video right now. I hope you'll join me. Let's go. All right, here we are in week 10 with our fun new 2-beat musical sight word with some really cool and fun 8th note syncopation. Being only 2 beats, this is going to align very nicely with our discussion from last week's video about the invisible bar line. This 2-beat pattern will only arrive on beat 1 or on beat 3. So it's going to accommodate that invisible bar line very nicely. So let's get into the rhythm right now and check out this diagram. And the first thing I want you to notice at the top in the diagram is the verbiage. The Tik-A is very, very straightforward. The flagged 8th notes are T at the beginning and the end of this rhythmic pattern. And right in the middle there, we've got a quarter note that remains Ta. And like I said in last week's video, a quarter note and longer will always be Ta. And in this case, our 8th notes will always be T, keeping it very, very straightforward so we don't have to be thinking too much about the verbiage when we vocalize these rhythms. Now, above this rhythm, you'll see that we've got a down arrow and then 2 up arrows. What does that mean? Well, as you probably guessed, that first one is going to arrive on a downbeat, and then the second 2 are going to be upbeats. So that's where our 8th note syncopation comes into play. Let's look at the diagram beneath this so that we can talk a little bit more about how the syncopation will work in this rhythmic motif. In this diagram, I've imagined taking 4 8th notes and deriving our new rhythmic pattern from those 4 8th notes by taking the middle 2 in this square and combining them together into 1 quarter note. We know that 2 8th notes are the equivalent value of 1 quarter note and vice versa. And then I just bring that quarter note down into the middle of my rhythmic motif. Now you'll notice that there's 2 stray 8th notes on both sides of the square, right here and right here. I've taken both of those 8th notes and just brought them right down into our pattern. Now, by doing this, we've created 2 upbeats. So I'm going to show you what this pattern sounds like just a single time first. It sounds like this. T, ta, T. Now, if I have 2 of these patterns taking up an entire 4/4 measure, it sounds like this. T, ta, T, T, ta, T. So you can hear that there's a downbeat, 2 consecutive upbeats, then we immediately come in on a downbeat, and then 2 consecutive upbeats again if we have this pattern happening 2 times consecutively in a 4/4 measure. Last week, I briefly introduced the concept of the tie. Now, in my book, and according to the sequential learning of what I feel is appropriate for students to learn when it comes to rhythm, ties have not been introduced yet. And there is intentionality behind the reason why I haven't introduced them yet. They come in a little bit later. We're almost there, but not quite yet. But believe it or not, ties can actually cause more confusion for students who are just beginning to understand rhythms and inherently understand time signatures. However, for those of you out there that really already have your heads wrapped around ties, you can also use the concept of the tie to create this rhythmic motif. Let me show you. Let's imagine these 4 8th notes again. So I've got my note heads, I've got my stems, I've got 2 beams here. Now, if I was to create this, I put a box around it in the first diagram, right? Well, a tie would also connect these middle 2 8th notes. And by having this tie in the middle, that would be the equivalent of this rhythm right here. which is our new rhythmic pattern for this week. The only difference is, and the reason why I introduced ties later, is because instead of T, ta, T, if I was to say this pattern, the one I just circled, it would actually sound like this. T, 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 because the eighth note is tied, and the eighth note is always T in the Tik-A-Tee verbiage. Now, what is the difference rhythmically between T, T, T and T, ta, T? Rhythmically, nothing is different. The only thing that's different is the way that we think about it and the way that we vocalize that rhythm. So that's just a little preview of the concept of ties, which will be introduced soon, so stay tuned for that video. Now, I want to draw our attention to the bottom of the page where I've included the numerical counting system beneath our new rhythmic motif. And the reason I've done that is so that you can actually see where those two upbeats are landing. And you will see that the quarter note comes in on the and of beat 1, and the last eighth note comes in on the and of beat 2. So again, T, ta, T, 1 and. All right, so you can hear that syncopation. So that's just another way that we could be conceiving this rhythm and thinking about this rhythm in our head. But the verbiage through the Tik-A-Tee method, T, ta, T. And you'll notice this box over here, and I'm talking about holding the quarter note full value. It is not T, ta, T, T, ta, T. That would actually be inaccurate unless there was some sort of articulation to notate that that middle quarter note is short. We want to hold it full value. It will actually help us perform this rhythm more accurately. T, ta, T, T, ta, T. So holding it full value, understanding that there's a downbeat followed by 2 consecutive upbeats. And if it comes in on beat 3, the counting system would be this: 3 and 4 and. So it would come in on the and of 3 and the and of 4. 3 and, 3 and. And as I've said in our exercises, this 2-beat musical sight word will only arrive on beat 1 and last for 2 beats, or on beat 3 and last for 2 beats. So again, we can find that invisible bar line really nicely. Okay, we've gone over this page in great detail. It is now time to go find some of these 2-beat rhythm patterns in our exercises. We're going to go to 10A right now. I hope you'll join me. Let's go. All right, here we are at exercise 10A. Now, in last week's video, week 9, I extensively analyzed our exercises. I introduced the new concept of the invisible bar line. I went through each beat and each measure, taking a significant amount of time to be sure we really grasped all the concepts, the measures, the beats, so forth and so on, before we performed it, before we vocalized it. Moving forward in these videos, I would like to take a more realistic amount of time to analyze them before we vocalize them together. Now, for you using the book at home, and please keep in mind that these videos are only supplemental to the amount of materials and exercises that are in my book. But for you using the book at home, your goal should be 10, 20, 30 seconds of analysis before actually performing and vocalizing your rhythms. If there's a concept that's maybe confusing for you, you can take a little more time, up to a minute. But any longer than that defeats the purpose of actually sight reading the rhythm. And keep in mind the order of operations. You want to analyze an exercise, like I said, 10, 20, 30 seconds, minute tops. Then you want to vocalize it. You want to perform it with a metronome. Then you want to listen to the MP3 and check your accuracy. And then the final and most crucial step is to perform it on your instrument, especially if your instrument isn't the voice. It needs to be performed before you move on to the next exercise. So for this exercise, exercise 10A, I'm going to still go through it beat by beat, measure by measure, finding the invisible bar line, but we're just going to do it a little more efficiently and get to performing it a little faster. So here we go. Let's do it right now. All right, in measure 1, we've got T, 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 followed by an invisible bar line, and then we instantly recognize our rhythmic motif from week 6, our dotted quarter note to our 8th note, taking up beats 3 and 4. Measure 2, we have our new rhythmic motif from this week, taking up beats 1 and 2, T, ta, T. Then immediately on beat 3, we have this half note. Our invisible bar line falls right in the middle. Measure 3, ta, ta, invisible bar line, and then our week 9 motif taking up beats 3 and 4, ta, Tik-A. And the last measure on that line, we have this week's motif taking up beats 1 and 2. Invisible bar line falls right here. And then we've got our half note on beats 3 and 4, giving us that opportunity to look ahead to the next line. So important to be looking ahead when you sight read. In measure 5, we've got ti, ti, ta, invisible bar line, beat 3, ta, ti, ti. Next measure, measure 6, we've got our new motif from this week. We know that takes up beats 1 and 2. Our invisible bar line will fall right here. Then we've got ta on beat 3 and a quarter rest, our first rest in this exercise on beat 4 of measure 6. Then measure 7, ta, ta, invisible bar line, new motif from this week taking up beats 3 and 4. Then in the last measure we have week 9's motif taking up beats 1 and 2. The invisible bar line will fall right here, and we close things off on beats 3 and 4 with a half note. And like I always tell you, I tell my students to write -1 right here so we know that they're going to hold that half note full value. Okay, we've gone through this exercise a little more efficiently. We're going to get right to performing it and vocalizing it with a metronome. Right now, let's do it. I hope you'll join me. The first thing I want to do is erase all of this ink so you can see the exercise a little more clearly. You'll also notice that I've included the TikATeeMethod verbiage in this exercise for a little added assistance. I'm going to stick with the metronome from violinlounge.com. Thank you again to those folks for offering up a free metronome. So I'm going to get that started right now. We're at 74 beats per minute, or the quarter note equals 74. I will be vocalizing this on a G3. You're welcome to join me on that pitch, an octave higher, an octave lower, or a different note altogether, but I do hope you'll vocalize the rhythm with me. So here we go. 1, 2, ready, and ti, 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 ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ta, 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 Tik-A-tee, ta, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, ti, ta, 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 ti, ta, ti, ta, Tik-A-ta. Stop the metronome. Hopefully you heard that I held that last note full value, but there were also some times in there where I truncated a couple of notes ever so slightly so that I could breathe. When you have an exercise when there aren't many rests, it's okay to cut one off a little short so that you can take a breath and continue to vocalize. And keep in mind, I'm not a professional vocalist, but it's important that we sing these exercises on pitch so we're bringing musical relevance to rhythmic exercises. So important. Okay, the next thing, I always say, music is a language. It should be taught like a language. One of the most important things when we learn a new language is listening. That's where the 363 MP3s come into play. So we are going to go listen to the MP3 for exercise 10A right now and check our accuracy. Here we go. All right, here we are at exercise 10A on my website where all of the MP3s can be found. As you know, you've got one of three options here. You can just listen to the MP3 and check your accuracy that way. You can vocalize along with the MP3 and sing along the rhythm for exercise 10A, or you can break out your instrument if your instrument isn't the voice and play along with the MP3. Those are your three options. Here we go. Going to press play on exercise 10A right now. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ti, 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 ta, ti, ti, ta, ti, ta, 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 Tik-A-tee, ta, ti, ta, ti, ti, ta, ta, ti, 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 ta, ti, ta, 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 ti, ta, ti, ta, Tik-A-ta. All right, there's exercise 10A. So if you were singing along, fantastic. If you were just checking your accuracy by listening, fantastic. If you played along on your instrument, that's the most important step. And if you haven't done that yet, it is so crucial that you perform these exercises on your instrument. You can play along with the MP3, or you can set your metronome to whatever desired tempo you want to perform at and perform it on your instrument before going to the next exercise. So I hope that you're ready to move on to exercise 10B. Here's a performance first of 10A. One, two, three, four. All right, let's dive into analyzing exercise 10B as efficiently as we can. And we notice right away in measure 1, our new rhythmic sight word for week 10 is happening 2 times consecutively. So on beats 1 and 2, here it is, and on beats 3 and 4, here it is. And we divide that measure directly in half, knowing that our new rhythmic motif for this week is 2 beats long. So we have beats 1 and 2, invisible bar line, beats 3 and 4. In the second measure, we have T, T. This 8th rest is beat 2, and this 8th note finishes off beat 2, so our invisible bar line is right here. Beat 3, we've got a downbeat 8th note, then we have an 8th rest on the end of 3, followed by T, T. All right, so we have a syncopated flagged 8th note and a downbeat flagged 8th note in measure 2. Be careful. Measure 3, we have our week 6 motif, followed immediately by our week 9 motif, which is pretty cool. Invisible bar line divides those 2 motifs in half because we know that the dotted quarter to 8th note is 2 beats, and the dotted quarter note to 2 16th notes is 2 beats. In measure 4, we've got a half note on beats 1 and 2, so we have our invisible bar line right before the arrival of our new motif for this week happening on beats 3 and 4. Now we know what that sounds like, but we still need to do our best while we're saying that rhythm to be looking ahead to measure 5, especially when we're switching lines. And looking down to the next line at measure 5, we have ta, Tik-A, Tik-A, Tee, Tee, ta. Our invisible bar line will squeeze right in here between beats 2 and 3. In measure 6, we have ta, Tik-A, Tik-A, and then our new rhythm from week 10 happening on beats 3 and 4, and our invisible bar line will go right there. In measure 7, we've got a half note on beat 1 and 2. We have an off on 3 here, which is what I would tell my students, so they hold that half note full value. Then we've got that quarter rest on beat 3, and then TT here. Our invisible bar line goes after the half note before the quarter rest. And then in the final measure, we have our week 10 rhythmic sight word right there happening on beats 1 and 2. Our invisible bar line will go right here. Beats 3 and 4 will be that half note. We write -1 right here, so we ensure that we're holding that half note full value. Okay, we've analyzed exercise 10B pretty efficiently for these videos. So now we're going to go right to performing it and vocalizing it with a metronome. Here we go. The first thing I'm going to do is remove all this ink so that you can see the exercise a little more clearly. You'll also notice that once again for exercise 10B, the TikATeeMethod verbiage is included for a little added assistance. All right, let's get our metronome going at 74 beats per minute, or the quarter note equals 74. I will be vocalizing this on a G3, and I hope that you'll join me. Here we go. 1, 2, ready, and T-ta, T-T-ta, T-T-T, T-T, T-T-ta, T-ta, Tik-A-ta, T-ta, T-ta, Tik-A, T-T-ta, ta, Tik-A, T-ta, T-ta, T-T-T-ta, T-ta. All right, stop the metronome. Hopefully you heard that I held out as many notes as I could full value. There were a couple times in there I had to truncate a note ever so slightly just to make sure I could catch a breath to keep singing, but I maintained the integrity of the rhythm. Okay, we know we need to listen to the MP3 next. Music is a language. We would be doing ourselves a disservice if we weren't listening to this exercise performed accurately. So let's go to the MP3 for exercise 10B right now. All right, here we are back at my website where all of the MP3s can be found. We are looking at exercise 10B. Now, I know you know what your three options are here, so I'm not going to waste any time. We're going to get right to it. Here is the MP3 for exercise 10B. One, two, three, four. T ta T T ta T T T T T T T ta T ta Tik-A ta T ta T ta Tik-A Tik-A T T ta ta Tik-A Tik-A T ta T ta T T T ta T ta. All right, there you have it, exercise 10B. And if you have not performed this yet on your instrument, especially if your instrument isn't primarily the voice, now is the time. Before we head to the outro, here is a performance of exercise 10B. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, that does it for week 10. Thank you so much for joining me in this milestone double-digit video. I hope you were able to confidently add our new 2-beat musical sight word to your arsenal of rhythmic vocabulary. Please do check out my book, Rhythmic Sight Reading, the TikATeeMethod. You can find it at my website at roncastingway.com. You can also find it on Amazon and at jwpepper.com. And don't forget to check out my store, Ron Castingway Music, on Amazon. A lot of great resources there for music educators, music professionals, and music students alike. And if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, please do so. Hit that like button and that notification bell so you get the latest video. Thank you again for joining me. I really hope that these supplemental videos are helping you on your rhythmic journey to sight reading success. I will see you in week 11.